I call to order the plenary session on a risk-informed approach to sustainable development and resilience for countries in special situations of the 2017 Global Forum Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. Can I just remind everyone to please sit at your seats so you can request the microphone from your place. Let me take this opportunity to cordially welcome all of you to this session. My name is Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. I am Minister for International Development and the Pacific from Australia. I'm honoured to serve as your co-chair together with Her Excellency Minister Fatima Tasneem, Deputy Minister of Defence and National Security from the Maldives, and Ms. Fakita Mioloa Katoa Uti Kamanu, I will say that, I hope I did that well, High Representative, United Nations Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries and Small Island Developing States. The purpose of our deliberations this afternoon is to gain a deeper understanding of the progress made and challenges faced by least developed countries, landlocked developing countries and small island developing states in developing and implementing disaster risk reduction strategies in line with the Sendai Framework. Our panellists and audience members will share successful experiences and practical examples and identify means to overcome the main gaps and obstacles. The summary of our discussions here today will be reflected in the Global Platform Chair's Summary, which will be presented at the closing ceremony. The Chair's summary will be submitted to the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development to inform their deliberations on Sustainable Development Goals 1, 2, 3, 5, 9, 14 in July this year. Before we proceed, my co-chairs and I would like to make some introductory remarks on the theme of our discussion today. Australia welcomed the Sendai Framework as the global blueprint for disaster risk reduction over the period 2015 to 2030. However, we also recognise that every country faces a unique set of challenges in implementing its commitments under the Sendai Framework. These challenges will be shaped not only by the prevailing and future profile of hazards that countries face, but also by the underlying drivers of development and underdevelopment. The countries in special situations that are our focus today share one common feature, that of chronic vulnerability created by a combination of underdevelopment, marginalisation and fragility. This restricts the ability of communities, systems and institutions to cope when disasters strike. We should not forget that chronic vulnerability also generates an extraordinary resilience amongst those who become used to dealing with adversity. Harnessing this resilience should not be the foundation for strengthening our disaster risk management efforts. For my part, I have a special interest in the small island developing states of the Pacific as Australia's Minister for International Development and the Pacific. Their vulnerability is shaped by their smallness and by their remoteness. When Tropical Cyclone Pam struck Vanuatu in March 2015, as we were all convening in Sendai, 90% of the country was affected, causing damage representing 64% of GDP. Now let's just put that into perspective. If that scale of damages and losses had affected Australia, my country would have been looking at a damage bill of Australian dollars 1 trillion. Barely 11 months later, Cyclone Winston struck Vanuatu's Melanesian neighbour Fiji, causing US dollars $1.4 billion worth of damage. This scale of losses is unsustainable. Yet they mask the true costs of climate-related disasters in the Pacific, where small-scale events erode the resilience of communities and governments on an almost daily basis. Achievement of the global Sendai targets and the Sustainable Development Goals will hinge as much on our ability to mitigate the risks of small-scale events as it will on our success in mitigating the risks of large-scale headline-grabbing events. But there was a good news story to come from Tropical Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, with only 11 confirmed deaths, a testament to improved early warning systems. I would now like to invite my fellow co-chair, Her Excellency Minister Fatima Tasneem, to give her perspectives on the disaster challenges for sustainable development and resilience in countries in special situations. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Minister Perawanti Wells. Good afternoon, Excellencies and distinguished delegates. I'm deeply honored to be here today to highlight the experiences of the Maldives and small island developing states in the pursuit of disaster risk reduction. I would like to begin by thanking the UNISDR for inviting me to serve as a co-chair for this plenary session on countries in special situations. It is important that we take the time to draw critical attention to the value of improving disaster risk reduction and preparedness. Small island developing states, for instance, experience high levels of extreme weather from hurricanes in the Caribbean, cyclones in the Pacific, tsunamis in the African and the Indian Oceans, often coupled with both drought and flooding. The Maldives specifically faces numerous urgent threats, including increased rainfall, storm surges, flooding, and sea level rise. The existence of our 1,200 islands that are on average 1.5 meters above sea level are threatened by rise in sea levels and other climate-intensified hazards. The damage from natural disasters negatively impact all sectors and areas of life, from exacerbating water and food security to degrading economic growth and undermining progress towards sustainable development. Our geographic isolation and limited resource base often makes responding and rebuilding additionally and increasingly challenging. The Sendai Framework reflects the unique vulnerabilities of SIDS and other countries in special situations in the face of disasters, growing in frequency and scale, intensified by climate change. The Article 41 of the SFDRR recognizes that SIDS, LDCs, LLDCs require special attention in view of their high vulnerabilities and calls for durable partnerships at the international level to support implementation of SFDRR in accordance with national needs of these countries. The SIDS have also recognized the needs for resilience in achieving the targets of the post-2030 Global Agenda for Sustainable Development. There are international interlinkages with Sendai Framework and other related agendas and frameworks designed to provide organized implementation and monitoring of progress in reducing disaster risks. As we approach the upcoming deadlines, in particular the deadline for SFDRR Target E in 2020, more focus at national levels need to be given towards mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into development planning. In Maldives, we are making efforts to mainstream disaster risk reduction across all sectors by advocating for the importance of relevance and coherence between SFDRR and the Global Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Despite our commitment, we continue to face challenges of limited financial and human resources and limited technical capacity, amongst others. While we push for new opportunities for partnerships and investment, we must also build on the political momentum garnered by this event to encourage greater support from member states to move beyond understanding to truly enhancing disaster risk reduction, governance, and preparedness. We are again grateful for the focus directed to better understanding the progress made in preparation and adaptation in LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS, and identifying how the remaining obstacles can be carefully addressed. Without action, our very existence is at risk. We are committed to seeing the Sendai Framework implemented in coherence with SDGs in order to see a resilient, sustainable future. I thank you and look forward to the conversation ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Tasneem. I would now like to ask Ms. Utoiko Kamanu for her opening remarks and to introduce our esteemed panellists.
Thank you, Minister Fierravanti-Wells. Distinguished panelists, excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to co-chair this plenary session focusing on reducing the vulnerability of countries in special situations. As my fellow co-chairs have stated, this is an important opportunity to reflect on how the most vulnerable members of the international community are progressing in achieving disaster risk reduction. It is critical that we take time to listen to those who are the most vulnerable and are living daily with disaster risk. They are well positioned to know how to reduce their risk and what support is needed to build more resilient communities. Since the adoption of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, the focus of all stakeholders is squarely on implementation and ensuring that there is coherence among the collective efforts of governments, civil society, the private sector, local communities, and the UN system. Among the countries where the successful implementation of the Sendai Framework is absolutely critical are the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states. The disproportionality of the disaster losses experienced by these countries is a major concern. As we have witnessed all too often, a single extreme weather event can erase years of development gains in a matter of hours. That development was not borne only by national governments, but also by local communities, by international development partners, the UN system, civil society, and others. Disaster losses are putting vulnerable countries on an unequal footing and depriving them of scarce resources which could be more usefully spent in areas such as quality education, health and infrastructure, which are vital to eradicating extreme poverty and ensuring more resilient, productive and peaceful societies. In addition, the challenges these countries face are further magnified by the growing impacts of climate change. For the most vulnerable countries, climate change is spoken in the language of severe droughts, melting glaciers, crop failure, land degradation, and rising sea levels. For those that are small island, future disaster losses are not just disproportionately high, they represent an existential threat. In this day and age of unprecedented global prosperity, rapid advances in science, technology, and innovation, the citizens of these countries should not remain entrapped in a vicious circle of poverty and vulnerability. It is clear that effective and holistic implementation of the Sendai Framework in coherent manner alongside other global agreements, and likewise the Istanbul Programme of Action for LDCs, the Vienna Programme of Action for LLDCs, and the Samoa Pathway for the SIDS will set vulnerable countries groups on a path of greater resilience. This also leads to positive results in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including tackling poverty, achieving food security, building resilient infrastructure, ensuring resilient human settlements, and strengthening adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and disasters. I'm certain that our distinguished panelists will share their experiences and lessons learned on what the challenges are on the ground, but equally important, what solutions we need to focus on that can be replicated and scaled up in these groups of vulnerable countries. Without further ado, I have the honor to introduce our three distinguished panelists. First, His Excellency Minister Desmond Mackenzie is the Minister of Local Government and Community Development of Jamaica. Minister Mackenzie has a long career in local governance and a wealth of practical experience in disaster risk reduction at the local level. He has served as Mayor of Kingston and Member of Parliament for Kingston Western constituency. Our second panelist is Mr. Raut, who is the Joint Secretary and Chief of Disaster Management Division, the Ministry of Home Affairs in Nepal. He has extensive knowledge and first-hand experience in disaster management at the local and national levels in Nepal. Joint Secretary Raut has worked with the National Planning Commission, Ministry of Physical Planning and Works, Ministry of General Administration, the Ministry of Land Reform and Management, and the Social Security Fund of Nepal. Our third panelist in place of Her Excellency Inoke Mutunga Wina, the Vice President of Zambia, we have Ms. Yandi Mapwe, the Head of Research and Planning, Disaster Management and Mitigation Unit under the Office of the Vice President. I would like to invite Minister Mackenzie for his initial reflections on today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me extend the courtesies of the government and people of Jamaica and say how privileged we are to be here to participate in this very important forum. The core principle of the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction is that development can only be sustained when it reduces and exposes vulnerability to disaster risk, avoid the creation of new risk, and address the underlying drivers to disaster risk. Jamaica, being a small island state, has a population that is concentrated mainly in the coastal towns across the country. 50% of the country's core physical assets are located within the coastal zone. While Kingston, the capital city, is the prime location of government service, it is projected that this section of the island will be most significantly affected in terms of changes to the weather pattern. Jamaica also has an economy that is dependent on agriculture, fishery, tourism, and manufacturing. And continuously on a daily basis require us to put in the necessary mechanism to reduce the question of vulnerability to natural hazards such as hurricanes, floods, tidal surges, earthquake, as well as man-made situation. For instance, fire, oil spill, etc. from industries and solid waste disposal sites. Of particular importance are the communities that are located in close proximity to most of these areas. The lack of social and economic opportunities of individuals. People live in vulnerable areas, become displaced with the onset of flash floods, and such as we have seen along several rivers in sections of the island. As a result of land slippage, events such as seen within the most dense sections of the eastern and northern sections of the island. These areas are based on their location. They are usually the first areas to be impacted by rainfall and hurricane events. Agriculture, which is one of the main economic bases of the eastern section of the island, is often impacted, resulted in a downward trend for the sector. Over the past 2 decades, disaster has impacted significantly on the gross domestic product of the country by some 2 to 3%. Quite recently, the heavy rains that have been affecting the island has resulted in the government downgrading the growth projection for this year. The social, economic, and environmental consequences of disaster are most obvious in the most vulnerable regions. Among these are the threat to small farmers, who are in most cases the breadwinners of their family. It affects the pregnant mothers to reach health facilities. It affects clean running water. It affects the delivery of proper health service. These are true special circumstances that we, as local government practitioners, must attend to. There are also those who are homeless or maybe not have a suitable roof over their heads. Should rain fall, an event which persists, it may also be the elderly who has no children, who lives alone and is fearful to relocate to areas which are much safer. We could also talk about our visitors. Tourism accounts for a significant portion of Jamaica's foreign exchange. And once the tourism sector is affected, it means that a significant portion of our economy is affected. We feel that our visitors should never be afraid, should never wonder what the impact of a Category 3 or 4 hurricane would do in terms of destruction to Jamaica. Still, there are those who consider to be better at the social and economic level, receiving building approvals to construct, but many become affected by coastal changes, such as we have seen along the southern and southeastern coast of the island, especially those who lived in what we deem to be informal settlements in the community. We have seen, ladies and gentlemen, on many occasions, the effects of poverty, the effects on the lives of individuals living in areas that we deem to be unsuitable for persons to live. The most recent heavy rains in the country reminds us of the need to approach disaster management with a view to reduce risk and lower the problems associated with such disaster. A bottom-up as well as top-bottom-down approach. The present structure adopted in Jamaica is holistic and allows the local parish disaster coordinators to interface with the national disaster coordinators under the leadership of the National Disaster Risk Management Council, consistent with the recent approval of the National Disaster Risk Management Act of 2015. This approach builds on the existing framework and the institutional arrangements where the local authorities are encouraged to implement risk reduction management centers with local bases as a mechanism to strengthen local planning areas, an integrated and comprehensive framework for the effective spiral planning and modernization framework for the building industry. This includes risk and vulnerability analysis, as well as accurate spiral data being used to inform development, investment decisions. Jamaica is presently strengthening the role of technology and the GIS, using disaster management in a spiral planning and most disaster assessment through risk information platform. A legislative framework that empowers institutions to reduce risk and to respond to the populations which are maybe affected, whether by way of evacuation or declaration of disaster areas. As previously mentioned, the National Disaster Risk Management Act, which was approved by the Parliament in 2015, while Jamaica proposed a new Building Act, which I tabled in Parliament and will be debating in the next 2 weeks. These are instruments which we expect to significantly enhance Jamaica's fight to implement risk reduction strategies consistent with the principle of the framework on which we are presently discussing. The ongoing public education program that builds knowledge and awareness amongst local affected population. While there is the ongoing education, local and nationally, we continue to strengthen these areas towards community resilience. A robust communication system that facilitates early warning to communities that will likely be impacted, and the continuous uninterrupted communication internally and externally. Jamaica is presently organizing itself to implement a modern telecommunications network to improve communications amongst the stakeholders before, during, and after the event. We want to acknowledge our Japanese friends who have partnered with us, with whom we have recently signed a grant agreement to facilitate the project. A financial framework that aids companies to rehabilitate, build back. Jamaica believes that this area is required to be strengthened, and is presently the existing framework does not support countries to successfully receive benefits as may be desired. Strengthening resilience through the improved infrastructure with support from the World Bank. Jamaica is presently implementing a disaster vulnerability reduction project, which is geared at strengthening key infrastructures such as bridges, roads, fire stations, and schools. We also want to thank the World Bank for the continued partnership. This partnership is also expected to deliver improved climate risk atlas and other infrastructure needs. A continuity of government plan, noting that Kingston is the seat of government. Jamaica is currently exploring options to ensure that the continuity of government in the event of a worst-case scenario. This, we believe, is critical to guarantee the continued service delivery from the government. It is my conclusion, finally, that a risk-informed approach to sustainable development and resilience in special situations requires transformational leadership. Change includes seeing ourselves as partners rather than individual states, and taking responsibilities to provide disaster management service in the most effective manner. This requires a commitment, courage, and servanthood. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister Mackenzie. I now invite the Joint Secretary Rout to share his perspective.
Thank you, Excellency. Our Excellencies, panelists, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great privilege for me to attend and speak in this important forum. On behalf of the Government of Nepal, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Government of Mexico and the UNSDR for organizing this event. I feel privileged for being part of this important discourse together with eminent personalities around the globe to exchange views on risk-informed approach to development. It is an opportune moment for discussion in the aftermath of international agreements upon what development goals to be achieved by 2030. The entire global community, including the scientists, the political leaders, and the development advocates, have converged to one common point, that development to be sustainable and needs to be resilient. And we all need to work together to achieve this. I want to thank the UN for providing firm support over past decade to unite the entire world on this common agenda and charting out ways and means to realize this. The crux of risk-informed approach to development lies in the Sendai Framework for DRR, which recognizes non-risk-informed policies as one of the underlying drivers of disaster risks. The Sendai Framework's guiding principle note that risk-informed public and private investments are more cost-effective and contribute to sustainable development. When we talk about Nepal's development, two things come into mind. First, Nepal's fragile topography with multi-hazard risk exposure, and second, high vulnerable sectors of the economy like agriculture that majority of the 29 million population have to live with, which may undermine the realization of its economic growth potentials and erode and obstruct the overall development process. Currently, the institutional and funding arrangements in place are not conducive to comprehensive and integrated approaches across sectors and levels. Work on DRR and climate change is often pursued in silos. Donor funding for DRR tends to be fragmented, sometimes not aligned with national policies, priorities, and is overly focused on middle-income countries, leaving landlocked and least developing countries without support they so desperately need. DRR is also predominantly funded from emergency budgets, which inhibits medium to longer term efforts to build resilience. However, Government of Nepal is mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into development plan and trying to integrate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction for better development outcome. Since 10th Plan 2002 to 2007, Government has recognized disaster risk management as a cross-cutting issue and explicitly mentioned the objectives and strategies. Government of Nepal has implemented Sustainable Development Agenda of Nepal for 15 years, 2002 to 2017, and the National Strategy on Disaster Risk Management 2009, which played instrumental role in unfolding disaster risk management and sustainable development in different sectors. The recently endorsed 14th Development Plan clearly identifies disaster risk strategies and priorities. It envisages to implement programs that are not only environment friendly but also adaptive to climate change. Nepal has implemented National Adaptation Plan of Action to Climate Change since 2012, followed by a National Framework on Local Adaptation Plans of Action to Climate Change. However, despite a lot more needs to be done by Nepal. It has taken some firm steps that build the foundation of sustainable development. Kindly allow me to share some of the initiatives that we have taken in collaboration with our partners. Building on the National Strategy for Disaster Risk Management, we are in the final stage of developing National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy and Strategic Action Plan based on Sendai Framework. We have taken a multi-stakeholder approach for developing this policy. The process is led by the government, but fully engaging the donors, UN agencies, NGOs, and private sector. We have also given utmost priority to revise our disaster risk reduction and management legislation to make more comprehensive together with an appropriate institutional arrangement. The new legislation will also define the specific duties and responsibilities of three tiers of government, the citizen, and the society as per the Constitution of Nepal. We have recently reviewed our disaster management information system and our capabilities to collect and analyze the data, anticipate the future trend and forecast and generate evidence to make our development risk informed. To enhance our capability for disaster preparedness and response, we have established a network of 56 emergency operation centers throughout the country with objectives of collecting real-time data and facilitating emergency response. The end-to-end early warning system has been successfully established in 2 glaciers and few selected river basins. The system has proven its effectiveness to save the lives of the people vulnerable to floods. Thank you.
Thank you, Joint Secretary Raut. I would like now to invite Ms. Yande Mapwe from Zambia to share her thoughts on that.
Thank you, co-chairs. As was stated earlier, I'm sitting in for my vice president who's currently attending a press conference. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is my singular honor and privilege to participate in this plenary on a risk-informed approach to sustainable development and resilience for countries in special situations. One of the historical issues for Zambia has been its lack of access to the sea, and this we can never graduate from, being landlocked. We, however, are more than ready to confront the inherent challenges with absolute resolve and determination in order to propel the development mantra into effective productive capacities and necessary drive for our development aspirations. My government, in collaboration with its development partners, is undertaking significant steps in linking Zambia and the rest of the sub-region through the development of transport infrastructure. We've embarked on the Link Zambia 8000 project aimed at connecting Zambia internally and link it to all our 8 neighboring countries, taking advantage of our unique location. This land linking infrastructure will facilitate ease movement of our people as well as goods and services. Furthermore, Zambia, in partnership with its neighboring countries, has a one-stop border post. This is between ourselves and Zimbabwe, which has reduced transit time for goods and services as well as vehicles from 9 days to 9 hours only. Efforts are underway to replicate this best practice in our other bordering towns. Distinguished delegates, despite progress being made in achieving sustainable development, disaster risk reduction is equally an issue of great importance to the development of countries that are landlocked and landlinked. Landlocked developing countries member states are highly vulnerable to disasters such as persistent drought, desertification, earthquakes, etc. Due to dependency on neighboring countries for transit, trade, and telecommunication connectivity, the LLDCs are also vulnerable to impacts of other disasters that do not necessarily happen within their borders, such as livestock diseases, as is the case for Zambia. Furthermore, most LLDCs lack good health and strong health services at borders, critical in reducing the risk of disasters. In this regard, there is need to strengthen early warning systems and surveillance for public health events at borders for all LLDCs. The occurrence of large-scale disaster diverts our resources and attention from seeking long-term solutions to structural impediments such as landlockedness and extreme poverty, to the recovery and reconstruction of the impacted communities. It also slows or reverses our progress towards the achievement of the SDGs. I'm very grateful that the Sendai Framework makes specific references to landlocked developing countries and calls for special attention and support to augment domestic resources and capabilities through bilateral and multilateral channels in order to ensure adequate, sustainable, and timely means of implementation in capacity building, financial, technical assistance, and technology transfer. Distinguished delegates, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and overcoming the economic and social implications of being landlocked would require assistance of all of us to help build the resilience. Capacity building support, science and technology are critical in supporting our efforts to build our resilience to disasters. I thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing your insights on the challenges and opportunities in taking a risk-informed approach to sustainable development in LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. I'm sure many of you in the audience would wish to contribute to the discussion with questions and interventions, and I now hand over to my co-chair, Minister Tasmin, to facilitate the discussion between the audience and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Uto Kamano, and to the panelists. I would like to open the floor now for open discussion. In order to maximize the time available to us and allow as many participants as possible to take the floor, I urge all speakers to kindly observe the time limit of 2 minutes for interventions. All participants are invited to speak from their seats. Kindly please return to your seats. Those who wish to make an intervention or pose a question to the panel are kindly asked to press their microphone button to be added to the speakers list. If you don't have a microphone in your seat, write your name and organization on a piece of paper and hand over to the volunteers who will be around somewhere near you. Right. So I would like to now open the floor for interventions. Thank you. Kindly please press the button on the speaker system. That will help us notify you, identify you. We have one delegate from Mongolia. Yep. Could you please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Thank you to chairman and panelists. Now, I'm privileged to represent Red Cross and Red Crescent movement from the Mongolian Red Cross Society. As many of you know, Red Cross, Red Crescent movement serves auxiliary role to the respective governments within compound of their Red Cross national laws. The national societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, supported by International Federation of Red Cross, is contributing to the implementation of Sendai Framework by engaging local actors and commitments to take concrete steps to support local communities. Using this opportunity of a global platform for disaster risk reduction, the world's largest gathering of stakeholders committed to reducing disaster risk and building resilience. The Red Cross and Red Crescent movement intends to reach communities through their local actors, ensuring their commitments towards disaster risk reduction. For this action, all the national societies of Red Cross, Red Crescent movement united together for the 1 billion coalition for resilience are fostering community resilience with their participation in behavior change and localization of disaster risk reduction. Mongolia is one of the 32 landlocked development countries in the world, sharing the same challenges and vulnerabilities in both natural and man-made hazards. Unpredictable patterns of climate increased the frequency of flood and extreme winter in Mongolia. To systematically address the gaps in DRR, Mongolian Red Cross is working towards engaging communities in the government. We have very strong partnership with Mongolian emergency management organizations at all levels. The first step of community engagement started with local participatory approach in national vulnerability and capacity assessment. At the community level, they identified the vulnerabilities. Also in local level, we provided vulnerability capacity assessment. Now in Mongolia, Mongolian Parliament approved new law on disaster risk management, disaster protection. Now this law highlighting the community and Red Cross roles and responsibilities in disaster risk reduction at all levels. Now finally, I would like to call all states and the local authorities and communities to devote careful attention to risk-informed approach to empower their communities, localize the disaster risk reduction agenda, and establish enabling environment for local action. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Do we have, there is one intervention to be made from SCBD UN8. Can you please identify yourself?
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Mr. Mamadi Diakite, and I'm the Chief of Security, Humanitarian, and Fragile State within UNAIDS, based in Geneva. And I was extremely pleased while hearing the communications, particularly the one coming from the Honorable Minister from Jamaica, stressing the need of lack of data. I think very recently, UNAIDS has been engaged in trying to work consistently on the overall situation of fragile countries, taking into account that, those countries are specific, their needs sometimes are also specific, and most importantly, the capacity of those countries sometimes are weak, and the resources are also very scarce. So what are the challenges that we believe are most critical as of today? Of course, the lack of data for monitoring and evaluations is extremely important. We believe that, under crisis situations, there is not sometimes very oftenly some policy guidance on how to quite really operate in those countries in a more effective manner. It's also quite really important to quite really stress the need in articulating the civil society involvement and making sure that no one is left behind. What do we mean by no one is left behind? It means that all those communities sometimes facing very difficult circumstances are not quite really neglected under a crisis situation. So part of the recommendation that one can consider, we've recalled that sometimes in 2011, there have been a new deal on engaging in some of those countries. Perhaps some of the critical recommendations should be put on the table in terms of the actions, how to fast-track the financial management, particularly during the crisis moments. How to increase also the capacity developments, making sure that, in terms of crisis, the aid delivery will be quite extremely timely in a more effective manner. So we should also encourage sharing comparative advantage in some of those fragile countries, taking into account that, they do have a very positive experience that can be quite very much valuable to others. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I do not see any more hands. Right. Could you please identify yourself to us? Can one of the volunteers help her?
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Daria Maknachova from the International Organization for Migration. Thank you very much to the distinguished panelists who made very insightful presentations today. And I was glad also to hear a few references to displacement, which is a huge challenge that many countries face. I would like to remind that disasters displace millions of people every year, and countries in special situations are particularly affected and have very limited means and capacities to respond at times. Such displacement significantly undermines our efforts to achieve long-term sustainable development goals. And the Sendai Framework recognized both the importance of reducing and preventing displacement, and also recognized the possible contributions of migrants to reducing disaster risk. So disaster risk reduction strategies should really consider addressing displacement, preventing displacement, improving data on people displacement in order to be able to provide solutions to this, and also see how migrants could contribute through their skills, through their investments, through their ideas. And actually, we have some evidence following the Indian Ocean tsunami, for example, that showed that many affected communities benefited immensely from the support of their diasporas through remittances and through investment. So I would like to ask the panelists if they could provide their views on what is the scope for addressing these issues at the level of their countries and their national disaster risk reduction strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would the panelist, one of the panelists would like to address? Do you have a specific question to the panelist? That would be helpful for the panelists because it was a long intervention. So if you have specific question, could you please?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
One of the questions you ask is how do we cope with displacement? That's a challenge, especially for us in Jamaica, because of where we are situated as a country. A disaster that takes place in the middle of the island would affect the total question of relocation. But what we have been doing as a country in response to relocation is to declare areas as no-build zones, those areas that we consider to be vulnerable in case of flooding. The new building bill that we have tabled and which we hope to pass in Parliament will also go a far way in assisting in that area. But the question of relocation poses a challenge because in most cases, after the event, residents have to go back to the same community, and because of the extent of the damage, not just to that particular area, but the extent of the damage across the country makes it impossible for us to effectively undertake a relocation exercise to the point where we are satisfied that we are able to respond to all the needs.
Thank you, Minister Mackenzie. I would like to now invite the lady in the second row in the VIP section. Could you please identify and make your intervention? Thank you.
Can I speak? Yeah. Ma'am, here, can I speak?
Just give me a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Malashri from United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office in Indonesia. Reflecting on the previous questions, I like to, which are talking about the linkages between the natural disasters and conflicts, displacement, climate change related displacements, and so, the overall impact on the Sustainable Development Goals and its achievements. So is there an international integrated monitoring system which takes into account all the different DRM-related frameworks such as SFDRR, WHS, New Urban Agenda, Paris Agreement? So how does it feed into the SDGs monitoring system? All these different, because all these disaster risk management frameworks talks about different aspects of disasters, but really not comprehensive. I don't really see a comprehensive coverage of all the disasters in SDGs monitoring system and the various commitments which we have right now to achieve until Agenda 2030. So maybe because also the SFDRR and the UN Plan of Action clearly mentions about all these different frameworks, but the tools which are available currently, the words into action, and also the Sendai Monitor, it doesn't really reflect the comprehensive nature of the complexities and the hazards and disasters which we are facing currently. So, yeah, thank you.
I think that's a very good question. I think my colleague here from UNISDR could help her with an answer.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for a pertinent question, which actually is the thread that is going through all of our discussions in the global platform. And it is about the coherence between all the different international frameworks, whether it is the Sendai Framework, whether it's the financing for development, whether it's the sustainable development goals, or the Paris Accord on climate change, or the new urban agenda. So we indeed are in the quest, and we all are looking for the answers to ensure that coherence, both at the global level as well as at the country level. And I believe the Deputy Secretary General also was highlighting that very strongly in her statement earlier. Now, I think there's been some very good progress also very concretely. As the open-ended intergovernmental expert working group developed the indicators to measure progress to achieve the 7 targets of the Sendai Framework, we also associated that work very closely with the work related to the SDG indicators. And actually, they are now integrated. So that's one very concrete way of moving forward. But of course, there is much more work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to now invite Colombia for the intervention. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Valoro significativamente los esfuerzos que han hecho ustedes en sus países para enfrentar los riesgos de desastre. Siempre que hay un desastre se evidencia una brecha significativa entre los esfuerzos que se han hecho y los que se debieran haber hecho. La pregunta concreta es, ¿cuál es su visión de futuro? ¿Qué debería hacerse para optimizar y ser más efectivos en sus esfuerzos locales, pero también para aprovechar la ayuda internacional, la transferencia tecnológica, transferencia científica y todo el apoyo que otros países desarrollados y la comunidad privada podrían ofrecerles para ser más efectivos en sus países, en la atención y luego en la recuperación de desastres?
Thank you. We have now, thank you for that comment. We have now India. Could you please identify yourself? The floor is yours.
Yes. Left-hand side, madam. Yeah. My name is Professor Niranjan Sahu from India. So thank you, Madam Chair, very much for your inviting me to speak something. I have no question actually. I am just putting my concern. I have been listening to many of the lectures presented here by many countries' delegations. But only one thing which I have observed here. So about the financing the disaster, investment on disaster management. So there is a varieties of, variabilities in the kind of different financial problem. My concern is here, since it is the problem is equal in everywhere in the world. All the nations are having same problems. Why this global platform of United Nations are not making mandatory provision for all the countries in the world to make some financial arrangements? So for example, many of the countries, after making their financial provision in the budget, in the budgetary provision, like agriculture, health, education, and other things, but at the last they put the finance for disaster management. Why should be at the last in disaster management? Once the people are, because countries, all the nations, all the countries in the world, they're losing at least 2% of their GDP. If they are able to, manage the disasters properly, so they can achieve 2% more of the GDP. I am talking about all the countries, not for India. If you look at India and China, both the countries, because they are contributing around 2/3 of the population in the world. When they face the disaster, their GDP, around 2 to 3% of the total GDP is, they are losing 2 to 3% of the GDP. Therefore, here my concern is, we should have proper provision for all the countries in the world, financial provisions, and all the countries should make some financial arrangement in their budgetary provisions. Thank you very much, ma'am. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent comment. I think it's a very pressing issue and a very thought-provoking issue as well. Is there anybody from our panel who would like to contribute to that? Thank you.
Yeah, I am in total agreement with the points you made. And it is important that bilateral and multilateral financial and technical support, as well as assistance provided by the development banks, better meet the disaster risk reduction needs of countries in special situations like you just mentioned. While the multilaterals provide some support, it is less stringent. The process for the release of grants is necessary, especially for countries, as you mentioned, which are continuously impacted within or beyond the designated season of a certain disaster. And one of the things that is required is for greater accessibility, especially for the SIDS countries presently accessing funds, which can be very, very inflexible. And there also need to be a greater transfer of technical knowledge to support these countries. And what is perhaps the most important of all is a government-to-government dialogue and agreement on the question of funds for countries such as the country that I'm from and from the region that I represent.
Thank you, Minister Mackenzie. I would like to now invite Azerbaijan. Could you please identify yourself? The floor is yours.
I'm sorry, it's not Azerbaijan, it's Austria. But thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to come back what Mrs. Mokhnacheva said beforehand about migration. We, from WMO, proposed a warning system, a multi-hazard warning system, which should be upscaled globally, which is done now in Europe, which has a standard which can be easily understood, which can be easily read, and which can be easily understood, especially by people from outside. Might it be migrants, might it be tourists, might it be foreign direct investment? And my question to the panelists would be how other UN organizations would support this initiative from WMO. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I go further with open discussion, I would like to now invite our panelists to your perspective on the coherence issue, which is a very important issue that we are talking about. While we talk about all the frameworks and global agenda and the coherence between all the different frameworks we are talking about, the Paris Agreement, the Global Agenda for 2030, and this SFDRR. What kind of work is being carried out in your countries to have coherence between these different agendas and frameworks? Thank you.
Well, Jamaica plays a critical role in the region. We participate in almost all the forums. And we contribute in terms of recommendation and the Sendai Agreement. We facilitate a number of workshops. We facilitate training in various areas. However, the greater support that is required to galvanize countries in special situations to undertake disaster risk reduction and to build resilience, especially within the context of sustainable development goals, through greater and strengthening partnership within the Caribbean. This partnership is visible throughout the relationship with Jamaica and many of the Caribbean territories, such as Haiti, Suriname, and Cuba. In the case of Haiti, Jamaica is actually the conduit that is used to provide assistance to the people of Haiti because of our location in the region. But there need to be a stronger and more vocal local voice on issues affecting the smaller states. One of the comments from the floor spoke about the question of support for smaller state countries. What we need is greater appreciation of the needs, of the real needs of the smaller states. And I believe that once these needs are understood and appreciated, then our role in terms of what we want on the global stage will be much more appreciated. But it is unfortunate because of our size geographically and economically, we are not given the kind of prominence and support that is required to make us the kind of countries that we ought to be in response to disasters.
Thank you. I would like to have a different question for our panelist from Nepal, Joint Secretary Raut. How has the Sendai Framework guided reconstruction efforts in Nepal following the earthquake in 2015, specifically in terms of resilient infrastructure and building back better? Can you share some examples of innovative approaches and policies tailored to Nepal's specific context on this particular issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency Chair. The 2015 Gorkha earthquake was the most damaging that Nepal had experienced for the last 8 years. The severe impacts were not only due to the large magnitude of the earthquake, but also a result of significant vulnerabilities that Nepal had accumulated over several decades. It is indeed tragic that the earthquake struck barely a few weeks after the Sendai Framework for DRR was finalized. But Nepal's commitment, ownership, and active participation in the SFDRR ensured that the principles of Build Back Better became a cornerstone in the Post-Disaster Needs Assessment (PDNA) and subsequently Nepal's recovery and reconstruction initiatives. I try to highlight some of the salient features. First, the government decided to assess areas at risk and took measures to avoid rebuilding in the vulnerable area. 118 settlements throughout the earthquake-affected districts have been identified and marked unsafe, and provisions made to provide $2,000 to each affected family to purchase land in safer locations. Second, the National Reconstruction Policy has evolved to guide resilient recovery and reconstruction. Owner-driven reconstruction model has been adopted, and government is providing technical services to the affected families with the designs of earthquake-safer houses. More stringent building code provisions have been brought into force. For instance, in all settlements with more than 1,000 houses, stricter norms for construction have been made mandatory and enforced strictly. Third, the government has provided a grant of $3,000 to each affected families to reconstruct houses by adopting seismic safety features. In addition, $1,000 provided to each household for retrofitting of partially damaged houses. Similarly, about $2 billion per year is allocated by the government of Nepal to reconstruct public infrastructure, heritage sites, grant distribution for private house reconstruction, and building livelihoods of affected families and most at-risk communities since the 2015 earthquake. The similar amount of investment is placed by development partners, and even higher amount of investment by individuals and private sector has been estimated during the period. It has created huge demand of labor and construction material in local market, which definitely increased the local employment opportunities. Because of the investment and employment opportunities, the current fiscal year GDP growth rate is estimated to increase by nearly 7%, which is the highest growth rate since last 30 years. In conclusion, all of the priorities under Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction have been adopted in Nepal's reconstruction and recovery initiatives, which will certainly contribute to achieve the target of resilient recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Joint Secretary Raut. I would now like to turn to my left, my panelist from Zambia, Madam Mwape. I would like to ask a question. Given the importance of infrastructure that connects LLDCs with markets and ports through other countries, which you have highlighted in your speech as well, what steps has Zambia taken to ensure that investments in critical infrastructure are risk-informed? What has been achieved? Where are the gaps that the international community and private sector can fill the gap? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Co-Chairs, as I indicated earlier, Zambia has put in place a number of measures in terms of trying to achieve the global targets in the Sendai Framework. And as I indicated, one of the projects that we are implementing is trying to link ourselves to all the neighboring countries as well as in-country, and probably that to facilitate the issues of facilitating easy movement of the goods and services as well as our people. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now turn to our panel for final reflection on today's discussion. First of all, I would like to invite Minister Mackenzie for your strategic recommendation for LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS to achieve Sendai Framework Target E to develop national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Applying the risk information approach to national planning, what are the approaches to put in the necessary systems, information systems, to have advanced planning, the issue of a proper building code, proper building bill, to identify areas, as I mentioned earlier on, that speaks to the question of the no-build zone, and the building bill that we have tabled are just one of the steps. And the approaches is to educate, because public education has to be one of the main tools in allowing our people to have a greater appreciation to the question of disaster. There has to be a greater support in galvanizing countries in special situations to undertake the question of disaster risk reduction and to build resilience, especially within the context that you mentioned of the development goal. And these development goals can only be strengthened through partnerships within the region. And the region, not just speaking specifically of Jamaica, but the region needs to get the kind of support from outside and within to make the region much stronger and make the region put the region in a position to be advanced in meeting the new dispensation as it relates to development. The Sendai Framework, the Comprehensive and Integrated National Local Sustainable Development Program, addresses that underlying drive for countries such as ours in special situations. The framework, as it presently stands, is a tool that I think can be used to foster and to build national and local strategies to consider risk and as to put us as a country in a position to adopt the local sustainable development planning framework that is required to take us as a part of this wide landscape as a country that continues to be affected by disaster. One of our main focus is to ensure that we protect the economy of our country, because as I mentioned in my opening presentation, we have witnessed where the country has lost between 2 to 3% in GDP, and based on the latest situation involving the almost 5 weeks of rains that we have been experiencing, that is going to cost the country billions of dollars. We feel that there ought to be a roadmap that speaks to countries in special situation. There has to be an application for modern technology, modeling it in a way to inform and to make risk analysis and decision making, and to localize the efforts through the local government framework, as we have put in place in our new Local Governance Act, which was just tabled and passed about 2 years ago.
Thank you, Minister Mackenzie. I would now like to call final recommendation by Joint Secretary Rout. On the same topic, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Let me share my own reflection about the challenges in promoting risk-informed approach to development in Nepal. I strongly feel that though the need for all development to be risk-informed, we continue to work in a business-as-usual approach and in silos during formulation of periodic development plan and annual budget. Risk assessment are still seen as an additional element. We need to take this challenge and must try to change our own mindset first. Similarly, we must shift our thinking away from managing disaster events to addressing the underlying risks that are inherent in the development process. Likewise, risk-informed development requires a functioning risk governance system. Effective risk governance system is difficult to achieve and needs extensive collaboration and ownership from all the stakeholders, including multiple agencies within the governments. Furthermore, it also requires capacity development beyond the traditional training, and scientific and multidisciplinary analysis combined with local knowledge can provide practical solutions for addressing today's challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Joint Secretary Rout. I would now turn again to my left, the panelist from Zambia. I would like to ask a specific question, again in line with Sendai Framework Target E, substantially increase the number of countries with national and local risk reduction strategies by 2020. What measures has your government put in place to make this a reality?
Thank you, co-chairs, once again. Following the adoption of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Zambia, in collaboration with various partners, has put in place a disaster risk management framework which will facilitate the development of district-based disaster risk management strategies. The national framework draws its strength from the Sendai Framework itself, the National Disaster Management Act number 13 of 2010 of the laws of Zambia, the revised National Disaster Management Policy and Operations Manual of 2015, the Africa Program of Action for the implementation of the Sendai Framework, the SADC Disaster Preparedness and Response Strategy, the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and of course our own 7th National Development Plan, which was recently approved by Cabinet. The goal of the national framework is to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks in the country through the implementation of integrated and inclusive measures. With an integrated and inclusive approach, we aim to prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disasters, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen the resilience. The framework that we have developed outlines guiding principles, priority areas, annual targets, outcome indicators, programs, and activities. In addition, the coordination and implementation arrangements have been well articulated in our national framework. And we are very confident that with this framework put in place, we will contribute to Global Target E. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mwape. Thank you to our panelists for those useful recommendations. I would now like to hand over back to my co-chair, Minister Fairawante Wells, to summarize and offer some ways to move us forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister Tasneem. Allow me to summarise some of the priority actions that we can accelerate progress in implementing the Sendai Framework over coming years. Let me start by saying that it is abundantly clear that least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states are countries in special situations. They are under immense pressure from the increasing frequency and severity of disasters and the impacts of climate change. This pressure manifests through increasingly uncertain development prospects for some countries, and it is stretching their limited financial resources to reduce disaster risk in their countries. In that context, then, let me focus on 3 priority recommendations emerging from our discussion. The first recommendation relates to taking advantage of the mutually reinforcing sustainable development and climate change agendas when implementing Sendai. We heard our panellists and participants assert that climate change action, sustainable development, and disaster risk reduction must be more closely interlinked in these countries in special situations than in any other countries. This makes irrefutable sense. When resources and capacities are constrained, then we should be coalescing around common themes, not dispersing our efforts in multiple directions. More coherent, effective, and better organised implementation and monitoring strategies across these overlapping agendas will help realise the potential efficiencies and from this improve resilience and preparedness in the most vulnerable countries. To this end, ministries and other stakeholders need time and support to reorganise and integrate their work. Our discussion noted that many small island developing states are leading the way in incorporating disaster risk management and climate change adaptation into their policy and planning work. The Pacific region's framework for resilient development in the Pacific is probably the best example to date. I want to acknowledge this landmark achievement from a part of the world that is often peripheral to global dialogues. A second recommendation relates to the acknowledgement during our discussion that official development assistance remains a major source of financing for many countries in special situations. Panellists, such as my distinguished colleague from Zambia, and participants stressed that this reality puts a premium on regional and global partnerships. Strengthening partnerships will better support countries in special situations to expedite the development of nationally driven disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020 and, of course, their eventual implementation. Continuing to tailor financing instruments to the needs of countries in special situations remains an essential objective. Our distinguished panellist from Jamaica argued we need partnerships that reduce fragmentation of disaster and climate finance, making funding easier to access, and that commitment to the long term. We heard that governments must also play a role here too. They need to create enabling environments for the effective use of this consolidated, accessible, and predictable stream of financing. But it is not all about the financing. We need partnerships that can transfer knowledge and best practices from the global and regional to the national and local levels. Technology transfer in terms of enhanced early warning mechanisms, information and communication technologies, or sharing the know-how on building resilient infrastructure can drive risk reduction efforts and lead to better outcomes. A third recommendation relates to the governance changes required to drive the shift to managing disaster risk. Panellists and participants recognise that revising or developing disaster risk reduction policies and action plans in line with the Sendai Framework requires active government leadership, particularly in the least developed and most vulnerable countries. While developing national disaster risk reduction strategies is a crucial step, effective disaster risk governance is needed to follow through and execute. Legislative and regulatory frameworks need to empower institutions to respond to the needs of the population, drive implementation, and promote a comprehensive, multi-stakeholder and prevention-oriented approach to disaster risk reduction. To be effective and sustainable, panellists underscored the importance of multi-stakeholder and inclusive national and local disaster risk governance structures, with roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders, including governments and citizens, clearly articulated. This new governance approach must draw in climate and disaster risk assessments as a mandatory step in the formulation of national development plans and budgets. Disaster risk cannot be an afterthought to development planning. Silos that separate national development, finance, and disaster risk reduction functions must be dismantled. Disaster risk management must become part of the way we do development. It must be the way all finance, planning, and line ministries conduct their business. It also means that stronger cooperation is required across the public and private sectors to underpin investments in risk-informed development. Participants stressed this public-private cooperation imperative given the disproportionate economic impact of disasters on the most vulnerable countries. Disasters incurred tremendous damage to infrastructure in these countries. We heard this in connection with Jamaica's vulnerability and the recounting of the devastation from earthquakes in Nepal 2 years ago. The role of the private sector then was seen as critical to not only build back better in the wake of disaster, but also to build back better from the start through proper design and construction. To achieve this kind of transformation, these new ways of working must be appropriately planned, adequately resourced, and directly executed by countries themselves. If they are, then the benefits of the first two recommendations, coherence across the global development agenda and effective global partnerships, will be realised by these countries in special situations. So, to conclude, there are three priorities emerging from our discussion this afternoon. One, continue realising the synergies between the complementary disaster risk management, climate change and sustainable development agendas. Two, accelerate our development of new tools, instruments and partnerships to finance effective disaster risk reduction investments and to transfer risk reduction know-how. And three, build new governance structures that straddle the national and local levels, draw in multiple stakeholders and embed disaster risk in core national policy, economic planning and budgeting processes. I would like to now invite my co-chairs to share what resonated with them during the discussion and highlight one further key recommendation. Minister Tasneem, you have the floor.
Thank you, Minister. I would like to once again thank my distinguished co-chairs and the panelists for their thoughtful perspectives and ideas that will hopefully help move this conversation to our policy work on the ground forward. I would like to highlight on specifically two issues. One is the Sendai Global Target E, and the second is the coherence issue, which has been highlighted by several of the panelists as well here. In concluding, I would like to return to this central issue, which is Target E of Sendai Framework, which reads, substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. This closely approaching deadline should encourage us all to act as urgently as the time limit requires. Implementing disaster risk reduction is very important to Maldives, as it is to all countries in special situations. Many SIDS are leading in their work to incorporate the Sendai Framework and climate change adaptation into their work on sustainable development and other policy planning. To add to the contributions of the panelists around how to best implement Sendai Framework Target E, I would like to share one relevant example from the Maldives. We are currently working with UNISDR, national ministries and civil society, civil sector and the private sector in developing a national strategic framework aligning Sendai Framework, Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement on climate change. To avoid any repetition in implementation and to harmonize resources and for a holistic outcome, Maldives has started working on the developing an integrated national monitoring and reporting mechanism. I think this is a very important issue here, that we try to align and find coherence between all the different frameworks here, specifically Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Global Agenda for 2030, so that there is no duplication or repetition and there is harmonized effort in terms of outcome, in terms of monitoring and in terms of strategic frameworks as well. In terms of my final recommendation, I recommend strengthening regional and global partnerships, which my co-chair also addressed just now, that will foster nationally driven implementation. International and regional organizations can help expedite national efforts by providing technical inputs and resources, which was highlighted in our earlier discussions by the floor on the need and urgency for financial support from countries and multilateral and bilateral organizations. They can also support in creating forums and partnerships that can transfer knowledge and best practices at the regional and global level. As we join here in Cancun to call for more robust action, it is partnerships such as these that can act as catalysts for fruitful and meaningful action. We Maldives continue to be dedicated to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals alongside the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, and Samoa Pathway as all present clear overlapping spaces to improve our resilience and preparedness. I again thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Minister Tasneem. For a final recommendation and reflection on the plenary, I give the floor to my co-chair, Ms. Utoikoi Kamanu.
Thank you, and I think the advantage of being the last one to speak is that the co-chairs have spoken about a couple of the points that is relevant to our work. But I'd just like to emphasize a couple of points, and that is firstly the importance of maintaining the political momentum and the leadership. Secondly, the issue of limited finances and scarce resources, and due to the special circumstances of the three groups of vulnerable countries, the difficulties in the processes of accessing finances, there is a need to be more flexible on how funding could be accessed, because this funding is important for improving capacities within the countries, as well as improving data, as well as improving the legal and the regulatory framework. And then my last point of emphasis is the importance of coordination at a global, regional, national, and also at the community level, and the importance of partnership and working towards a common objective, so that we can ensure that we are effective in what we are trying to achieve at a country level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Utokai Manu, and thank you again, Minister Tasneem, for co-chairing this plenary with me this afternoon. Distinguished heads of state and government, distinguished ministers, distinguished representatives of intergovernmental organisations, United Nations agencies and major groups, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Before concluding the plenary session, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all participants for their forward-thinking and results-orientated interventions and for their cooperation and goodwill. I would like to add special appreciation to our distinguished panellists for sharing their first-hand perspectives on the challenges, but most importantly, the opportunities for LDCs, LLDCs and SIDS to address their disaster risk in ways that can reduce poverty and promote sustainable development for all. As mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, the summary of our discussions here today and the recommendations will be reflected in the Global Platform's Chair's summary, We have thus concluded the plenary on a risk-informed approach to sustainable development and resilience for countries in special situations. The meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.